In the flickering candlelight of a draughty stone chamber, a weary soul, much like yourself, may have lain down to rest centuries ago, as the distant sounds of a very different world echoed through the night. It was a harsh and often brutal time, when the concept of justice was a far cry from what we know today. In the coming while, we'll explore some of the most shocking and bizarre punishments inflicted upon those deemed guilty in medieval society. Though grim, these practices offer a window into the values, beliefs, and fears that shaped the lives of our distant ancestors. So let us steel ourselves and step back into an age when the price of transgression could be so very strange and severe. In medieval Europe, crime and punishment were deeply entwined with religious morality and the often ruthless power of the ruling elite. Justice, as meted out through torture, public humiliation, and ghastly execution, was as much about enforcing social control and inspiring terror as it was about fairness or reformation. The accused, if lucky, might escape with a painful trial by ordeal to prove their innocence in the eyes of God. The convicted faced a litany of horrifying fates meant to deter even the boldest would-be offenders. Imagine, if you will, the lot of a common thief, perhaps driven to desperation by hunger or simply tempted by opportunity. If apprehended and found guilty, they might be subjected to whipping, branding with hot irons, or even mutilation. Their hands cut off as a visible, permanent mark of their crime. For the peasantry, such punishments were a constant reminder of the perils of straying beyond the social order. Even for minor offences, the consequences could be deeply degrading. Picture a drunkard or blasphemer locked into the stocks or pillory in the centre of town, their head and hands trapped between heavy wooden boards. For hours, or even days, they would be at the mercy of the passing public, subjected to a hail of rotten food, filth, and ridicule. The shame of such public humiliation was a potent deterrent in close-knit medieval communities, but such indignities paled in comparison to the true tools of terror employed by medieval authorities. In dank castle dungeons and shadowed torture chambers, the accused might face the rack, a wooden frame to which they would be tied and slowly stretched, their limbs wrenched to the point of agony and dislocation to extract a confession or information. Other fearsome devices abounded, each more nightmarish than the last. The brazen bull, an oven in the shape of a hollow brass statue, would be heated by a blazing fire beneath it. The condemned, trapped inside, would be roasted alive, their screams rising out through tubes in the beast's nose to resemble the bellowing of an infuriated animal. It was a punishment as creative as it was cruel. Even in death, the horrors could be far from over. For the most serious offences, like treason against the crown, a traitor might face the dreaded fate of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The grisly process began with the victim being tied to a horse and dragged to the place of execution, then hanged by the neck until nearly, but not quite, dead. What followed was an agonizing ordeal of being cut down, disemboweled, and beheaded, the body then hacked into 4 pieces. The severed head would be displayed as a warning to all, while the quarters might be sent to the far corners of the kingdom as proof of the king's implacable judgment. Such vicious punishments reached their apex during times of religious persecution, such as the Spanish Inquisition. Heretics and supposed witches could face death by burning at the stake, a slow and horrific demise often preceded by brutal interrogation and torture. The Catholic zealots of the Inquisition employed methods both ghastly and surreal. A suspected heretic might face the infamous trial by Blessed Sacrament, forced to choke down dry communion bread to prove their innocence. If they gagged or choked, it was seen as a sure sign of guilt. It's hard to fathom the depths of suffering inflicted in the name of divine and temporal justice. Yet even in such dark times, there were glimmers of mercy and coincidence. Take the Scottish woman known as half-hanged Margaret, who in 1724 was executed for the crime of infanticide. After a botched hanging, she was pronounced dead and her body released to her family. But on the way to burial, she miraculously revived, and under Scottish law, her punishment was considered completed. She would go on to live for another 40 years, a living reminder of the whims of fate. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the old ways of punishment began a slow decline. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about human rights, reforming prisons, and fitting punishments to crimes. But the bad old days of the pillory and the rack cast a long shadow. Even today, the idea of medieval torture maintains a grim grip on our collective imagination. In our modern world of Miranda rights and humane incarceration, the brutality of medieval justice seems impossibly distant. Yet these centuries-old traditions of punishment speak to something fundamental in the human experience: the desire for order, the fear of the other, the need to impose power, and the fascination with the macabre. By probing history's darkest corners, we catch a glimpse of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go in balancing justice and mercy, security and human dignity. So as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the hapless medieval souls who met such grisly fates. They may seem to inhabit a barbaric and remote past, but in truth, they were not so different from us. Men, women, and children struggling to make their way in an often pitiless world. In that sense, perhaps we can find a shred of empathy amidst the horrors, and be thankful for the hard-won progress that lets us slumber in a gentler, more forgiving age. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. May your rest be undisturbed by the ghosts of bygone torments, and may you wake to a brighter tomorrow, secure in the knowledge that the worst of history's nightmares are behind us. Until next time, when we'll once again journey together into the shadows of the past in search of wisdom, perspective, and perhaps a little morbid fascination. But for now, sleep well. As the old adage goes, the wheels of justice turn slowly, but in medieval times, they often ground to a halt entirely, replaced by the whims of rulers, the fanaticism of religious authorities, and the baying of bloodthirsty crowds. For the unlucky soul who ran afoul of the law in those times, the result was often a punishment as bizarre as it was brutal. Take, for instance, the French practice of the boats, a method of execution that was as drawn out as it was agonizing. The condemned would be firmly trussed up and wedged into a small rowboat, immobilized, save for their head. Then, a second boat would be placed atop them upside down, sealing them inside a suffocating wooden tomb with just their head protruding. In this state, they would be left to slowly waste away and succumb to exposure and starvation, their face slathered with milk and honey to attract flies and vermin. It was a demise that could stretch on for days, even weeks, as crows pecked at their eyes and insects feasted on their flesh, transforming them into a putrid, festering mass. The 16th century historian Pierre de l'Estoile recounts the macabre spectacle of one such victim after 15 days in the boats. He was all swelled up, his eyes and his nose black and bruised, his cheeks eaten away so deep that there was nothing left but the teeth. Yet still, he weakly shook his head and dragged out a few unintelligible words as the insects droned around him. Such was the fate of prisoners of war, traitors, and notorious brigands condemned to this hellish punishment. But perhaps no case better illustrates the twisted ingenuity behind the boats than that of the Provençal bandit Jourdan de Laille in 1409. A Robin Hood-esque figure who had long eluded capture, de Laille was finally arrested after he drunkenly blurted out his identity in a tavern. Outraged at having been made a fool of for so long, the local magistrate devised an especially cruel variation on the usual boat's treatment. De Laille was placed between two hollowed-out tree trunks rather than boats, his body folded up inside and sealed with packed clay, with only his face left free. Then, the trunks were hung up on gallows in the town square for all to see, leaving the famous outlaw to die like a dog or a rat in a trap, in the magistrate's words. For 9 days, Delisle suffered in his excruciating wooden prison as the masses mocked his plight, until he finally expired with a last feeble groan. Such was the harsh justice of the age. Of course, France was hardly alone in devising cruel and unusual punishments. The powerful maritime Republic of Genoa had its own twist with the barrel, a technique used on prisoners and galley slaves. The condemned would be stuffed into a barrel with only their heads sticking out of a hole in the top. The container then filled up with the putrid filth and offal from the city gutters. The barrel would be sealed up and placed in the scorching Mediterranean sun, effectively transforming it into a suffocating, reeking oven. One victim of this ordeal was a Genoese sailor named Giacomo Tara, condemned in 1528 for defecting to work for the rival Venetians. As punishment, he was sealed up in a barrel and deposited on the roof of the city cathedral at the height of summer. For 3 days, the barrel baked in the blistering sun as Tara suffocated and stewed in the rancid muck until he finally succumbed to heat stroke and asphyxiation. His desiccated corpse was left in the barrel for weeks after as a reminder of the wages of betrayal. Down on Genoa's docks, troublesome prisoners might instead find themselves married to the sea. That is to say, fitted with 200-pound weights and dumped into the ocean, sinking instantly to the bottom. In an especially sadistic touch, they would sometimes be tossed in with a hose placed in their mouth, so that it would fill their lungs and stomachs with seawater on the way down. This was the fate of the political dissident Giulio Cesare Vacero in 1628 for plotting against Genoese nobles. He sank from view, dragged down to the silty seabed by the enormous weight chained around his neck and fitted into his mouth until he drowned in the cold, murky depths. As we've seen, medieval punishments could be truly horrifying in their brutality and creativity. But perhaps no form of torture was as unsettling as the use of animals to inflict slow, agonizing deaths on the condemned. One notorious method was the boat's punishment, most infamously employed in ancient Persia. The unlucky victim would be trapped between 2 small boats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. They were then force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, at which point even more milk and honey would be poured over their exposed face, hands, and feet. Immobilized in their own filth and swarming with insects attracted by the sweet mixture, the victim would linger for days or even weeks in unimaginable torment as they were slowly eaten alive by vermin and worms. The cause of death was usually a combination of dehydration, starvation, and septic shock. While the Persians were particularly fond of this sadistic practice, a similar style of execution was occasionally used in Europe as well, with one 16th century account describing a murderer in Nuremberg being trapped between 2 boats and left to rot. Just as chilling was the Roman Empire's apparent taste for executing criminals by way of wild animals like lions, bears, and leopards. Sending enemies, Christians, and common criminals into the arena to be ripped apart by beasts was seen as an excellent means of public entertainment. The unluckiest of the condemned were the Noxii, who would enter the arena completely defenseless to face their grisly fate. One of the most famous victims of execution by beast was the early Christian martyr Saint Ignatius of Antioch. According to tradition, around 108 AD, Ignatius was arrested by Roman authorities and sentenced to die for refusing to renounce his faith. He was transported to Rome, where he met his end in the Colosseum before a jeering crowd as lions devoured him alive. His graphic demise secured his status as an icon of courage and religious conviction. Animal executions sometimes took a slightly more symbolic approach, as in the German cities of Emmerich and Neuss, where Jewish communities were accused of host desecration in the late 15th century. To punish this perceived outrage against the Christian faith, rabbis and other prominent Jews were suspended over vicious dogs, which leapt and snapped at their victims until they eventually sank low enough to be mauled to death. A slow and terrifying ordeal that must have inflicted immense physical and psychological anguish. Another infamous example comes from 18th century Denmark. In 1772, a court in Aalborg sentenced 4 vagrants to death for allegedly committing bestiality with cattle and sheep. After decapitation, their bodies were burned along with the poor animals that were their supposed partners in crime. This grim scene illustrates how human barbarism sadly extended to animals as well in the rougher corners of medieval justice. Thankfully, the use of animals in torture and execution began dying out by the 19th century, with a few shameful exceptions like criminal elephant executions in South and Southeast Asia, which shockingly persisted into the early 20th century. As societies grew less tolerant of cruelty and more concerned with human rights, subjecting even the worst of criminals to such fates became widely regarded as excessively barbaric. Yet for much of the Middle Ages and beyond, being condemned to a beastly demise was a very real part of the European justice system. The threat of agonizing death by animal attack surely inspired sheer terror in the hearts of wrongdoers, and anyone else unlucky enough to find themselves on the wrong side of the law. One can only imagine the primal nightmares that must have stalked the dreams of those who witnessed these brutal spectacles. As stomach-turning as these practices seem to us today, they offer a window into the mindset of medieval people, who lived in a world where violence was an everyday fact of life. For them, hideous punishments weren't just about justice or vengeance. They were vivid reminders of morality and social order in a time when the threat of hell and damnation constantly loomed. So while we may be morbidly fascinated by the grisliest bits of history, medieval animal executions are important to study because they reveal so much about the values and power structures of the distant past. By examining these dark chapters, we're forced to reckon not just with the evils that humans are capable of, but the deep-rooted beliefs and fears that have shaped our understanding of transgression for centuries. Of course, the idea of criminals being eaten by wild animals now strikes us as repulsively inhumane. But what might future generations find appalling about our own approach to justice today? It's a sobering question to ponder as we await the Sandman's embrace. As we've seen, the twisted ingenuity of medieval punishments knew few bounds, but perhaps no practice better embodied the public spectacle and moral righteousness of criminal justice in the Middle Ages than the auto da fe of the Spanish Inquisition. The auto da fe, which means act of faith in Portuguese, was a grandiose public ceremony in which those convicted of religious crimes by the Inquisition, like heresy, blasphemy, or witchcraft, were sentenced and punished before massive crowds, often by being burned alive at the stake. These grim rituals, which could last an entire day, were as much religious rites as they were criminal proceedings. Imagine the scene. In a public square packed with thousands of onlookers, a long procession of the condemned, wearing tall pointy caps and dressed in rough tunics painted with hellish scenes, were paraded before the Inquisitor's pulpit. There, their crimes against the faith were announced, and their sentences proclaimed. Those who recanted might be spared a fiery death and sentenced to a penance like a pilgrimage or a flogging. But for the unrepentant, only the stake awaited. The largest known auto da fe took place in Mexico City in 1659, with over 100 people burned alive for heretical crimes like practicing Judaism or superstitious folk magic. The twisted pageantry was meant to be a visceral reminder of the Church's overwhelming power and the mortal perils of straying from orthodoxy. Few stories better reflect the self-righteous brutality of the auto da fe than the tragic demise of the Spanish theologian Michael Servetus. A true Renaissance man and polymath, Servetus made contributions to medicine, geography, and theology, but his provocative religious writings, which questioned the Trinity and infant baptism, quickly drew the ire of both the Catholic Inquisition and Protestant leaders. After being arrested and condemned by the Inquisition in France, Servetus escaped and fled to the Swiss city of Geneva, seeking refuge in the famed Protestant centre led by John Calvin. But Calvin, who had previously clashed with Servetus via letters, had the fugitive arrested and put on trial for heresy. In a bitter irony, Servetus was convicted and sentenced to death by the same Protestants who had broken from the Catholic Church over its abuses and doctrinal demands. On a chilly October morning in 1553, he was taken to the outskirts of Geneva, chained to a stake, and burned alive along with copies of his own treatises. His piteous cries for mercy went unanswered. The ghastly fate of Michael Servetus and so many others consumed by the flames of the Spanish Inquisition exemplified the suffocating grip of religious orthodoxy and the use of spectacle and agony as tools of coercion and control in the medieval world. A brilliant mind snuffed out for daring to question, to wonder. Of course, the Spanish Inquisition was but one of many religious persecutions that racked medieval and early modern Europe, from the Albigensian Crusade to the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries. Time and again, doctrinal disputes were settled with shocking violence, and the charge of heresy could mean an agonizing death without hope of reprieve. But not all religious punishments in the Middle Ages were quite so brutal. In fact, some practices that melded criminal justice with tests of faith seemed to leave room for the possibility of divine intervention on behalf of the innocent. One peculiar method was the trial by blessed sacrament, in which a suspected criminal was forced to swallow a dry communion wafer to prove their innocence in the eyes of God. If they choked on the holy bread, it was seen as a sign of guilt, the consecrated body of Christ itself sitting in judgment. But if they could swallow it properly, they were cleared of the charges, however improbably. This was the logic of trial by ordeal extended into the spiritual realm, that a just God would never allow an innocent to suffer, even if it took a miracle to save them. And sometimes, it seemed, those miracles did come to pass. Consider the strange case of a German woman named Christine Stromenger, who was accused of adultery in the 15th century and put to trial by blessed sacrament. Though she choked on the first 2 wafers, nearly suffocating each time, on the 3rd attempt, the bread went down smoothly and she was acquitted and released. Did the hand of God truly intervene on her behalf, or was it mere chance? In the pious medieval mind, there was little distinction. Mercifully, the use of trials by ordeal and blessed sacrament fell out of favour by the late Middle Ages, a turning point in the slow migration away from divine justice and towards a more rational theory of law. But the ghastly shadow of the Inquisition lingered over Europe well into the Enlightenment. The world of medieval crime and punishment was a landscape of extremes, of sin and salvation, sublime faith and shocking brutality. From the gallows to the pillory to the inquisitor's pyre, the criminal justice system was wielded as both a tool of social control and a stage for the drama of good and evil that transfixed the popular imagination. In this sense, perhaps no practice better captured the medieval mindset than the auto da fe, with its stark symbolism, moral certainty, and vivid spectacle of suffering as a pathway to redemption, at once horrifying and spellbinding, a ceremony of punishment raised to the level of sacrament. And so, as we reach the end of our journey through the monstrous and bizarre punishments of the Middle Ages, what are we to make of this tapestry of cruelty and piety? What does it reveal about the medieval world and its sense of justice, however alien it may seem to modern eyes? In many ways, the barbarous criminal codes and penalties of medieval Europe reflected the hardships and fears of an unforgiving age, a world of sweeping plagues and constant warfare, of hunger and religious upheaval. where violence was often the rule rather than the exception, and life itself seemed to hang by a thread. Perhaps in such a grim and precarious existence, the visceral horror of torture and mutilation, the scarring stigma of branding, even the mortal terror of the pyre, all became tools to deter those who would threaten the fragile order, to punish the wicked and set an example for all. Cruelty sublimated into a kind of rough justice, however ghastly it may appear in hindsight. But even in their darkest moments, we can glimpse the first halting steps of medieval justice away from mere brutality and bloodshed. The gradual abandonment of trial by ordeal in favor of juries and evidence, the occasional glimmer of mercy in a product of mob justice, the slow turning of the wheels of progress. And so, as the last shrieks of the blood echoed across the blood-soaked public squares of the Middle Ages, the seeds of a more humane vision of crime and punishment were already being planted, however tentatively. A vision that looked beyond mere retribution and violence, and towards rehabilitation, due process, and human dignity, however long and arduous the road ahead would prove. From the dungeons of the Inquisition to the torture chambers of princes to the killing fields of unjust wars, the spectre of medieval justice or injustice cast a long and haunting shadow. But in the end, it is a shadow that humanity, slowly and painfully, has begun to emerge from. And for that, we can be grateful. As we close the book on this dark chapter of history and drift off to more peaceful dreams, perhaps we can take some small solace in how far we've come since the days of the Iron Maiden and the rack, the branding iron and the stake, and resolve to never let the flames of cruelty climb so high again. Good night, dear listener, and may your sleep be free from the nightmares of bygone torments, and your waking hours filled with a more merciful light. As the flickering torchlight illuminated the dank stone walls of the dungeon, the accused man trembled before his grim-faced inquisitors. In a quavering voice, he proclaimed his innocence, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The hooded figures had already decided his fate. To prove his alleged crimes, they declared, he would undergo the trial by ordeal, an ancient judicial practice that left the judgment up to divine intervention. The method they chose was a particular favourite in cases of suspected theft or perjury, the trial by hot iron. The accused would be forced to carry a red-hot iron bar and walk 9 feet. If after 3 days his wounds had begun to heal, he would be declared innocent, his burns a sign of God's favour. But if the wounds festered, turning a telltale black, it would be taken as proof of his guilt. A just punishment, it was believed, for the falsely accused had nothing to fear from God's judgment. But as the poker was thrust into the glowing embers of the brazier, growing hot enough to sear flesh from bone, even the strongest man would grow weak with fear. For the trial by ordeal was a gamble with agonizing stakes, and not even the truly innocent could be assured of passing unscathed. Such was the precarious nature of medieval justice. In an age when the line between crime and sin was hopelessly blurred, the enactment of human law was inextricable from divine will. Punishments were brutal, public, and rife with superstition and religious fervour. The more agonizing and drawn out the sentence, the more it was believed to cleanse the soul even as it destroyed the body. One of the most infamous ordeals of the early medieval period was the trial by water, a deceptively benign name for a harrowing test of guilt or innocence. The accused would be bound hand and foot and cast into a lake or river. If they sank, they were declared innocent. But if they floated, it was a sign that the water, being pure, had rejected them, and they were promptly dragged to shore and put to death. Such was the damning fate of a Frankish noblewoman named Anstrude in the 9th century. Accused of plotting to murder her husband, the Count, with a poisoned fish, she was subjected to the ordeal of cold water to prove her innocence. When she failed to sink, her guilt was horrifically confirmed. though any hopes for a quick death were dashed. In a brutal twist, rather than a mere drowning or hanging, her sentence was to be sewn into a sack filled with live vipers and thrown into the River Saone. Not all courts resorted to such superstitious trials, but even the more earthly punishments could be gruesomely inventive. And no matter the means, it was always made into a public spectacle. For the medieval understanding of justice placed nearly as much emphasis on deterrence through humiliation and agony as it did on proving guilt. Hence the use of the stocks and pillory, those iconic wooden restraints which held the offender captive and immobile before a jeering, spitting crowd. Locked by the ankles and wrists and unable to hide his face, the accused would be splattered with dung and rotten produce, an object of ridicule and disgust. Though it lacked the maiming brutality of other tortures, the utter degradation of the experience was its own unique cruelty. One could almost pity Titus Wilkins, an English miller who found himself pilloried in 1347 for shortchanging his customers by cutting flour with sawdust. For a day and a night, he endured a hail of decomposing vegetables, clumps of manure, and worse, his finely embroidered tunic forever ruined by foulness. Only when his head lolled forward in exhaustion, his lips cracked and bleeding, did the last of the crowd disperse, their contempt spent. The message was clear. Here was a man whom society reviled, whom even strangers felt entitled to abuse and torment. A petty cheat, to be sure, but his shame made into a communal catharsis. No less degrading was the punishment of the scold's bridle, a sinister-looking iron muzzle which was clamped around the head of a nagging, gossiping or scolding woman. A metal bit, often studded with spikes, was forced into her mouth to hold down her unruly tongue. She would then be led through the town on a chain like a dog, enduring all the mockery and cruelty the townsfolk could inflict, until her husband reckoned she'd been broken of her troublesome habit. Such was the misogynistic fate of Margaret Brewster, an Englishwoman who was bridled and paraded through the streets of London in 1655 for the crime of being a common scold. Her husband, a well-respected merchant, had grown weary of her incessant nagging and publicly denounced her before the magistrate. The judge, in his infinite wisdom, declared that a woman's tongue is her sword and must be blunted. For 3 long hours, Margaret endured her torment, the cruel metal bit cutting into the soft flesh of her mouth until at last she fainted out of sheer exhaustion. When she was finally unshackled, her husband pronounced her cured of her shrewish ways. A blessing, perhaps, that the punishment hadn't driven her mad. But for all the petty humiliations of the pillory and bridle, they paled in comparison to the genuine horrors that awaited those accused of more serious crimes. In the torture chambers and dungeons of medieval Europe, all manner of hellish devices were waiting to break the bodies of the condemned. The rack was a particular favourite, a wooden frame to which the accused would be shackled hand and foot. As the torturer turned the handle, the victim's limbs would be slowly pulled from their sockets, stretching them out to the point of agonising mutilation. The pain was excruciating, enough to elicit false confessions from even the most staunchly innocent. Such was the unenviable fate of Nicholas Imeric, a Spanish monk who found himself on the rack in 1356 after being accused of heresy by the Inquisition. Though he had preached unwaveringly against the Cathars, a heretical sect, his impassioned sermons had begun to veer dangerously close to their beliefs. Seized from his monastery in the dead of night, he was dragged before the inquisitors and ordered to confess. For 3 days, Nicholas endured the rack, his joints popping and muscles tearing as he screamed out prayers for mercy. But his torturers were relentless, convinced that his piety was only a facade. It was only when, half mad with agony, he began to babble out a garbled confession that they finally relented. Released from his shackles, he collapsed into a broken heap, his body permanently twisted, and deformed. Nicholas ultimately recanted his confession, but it mattered little. The damage had been done, and he was forever marked as a heretic. He would spend the rest of his days locked away in a monastery cell, a crippled shell of a man, his mind shattered by the horrors he had endured. But even the brutal efficiency of the rack paled in comparison to the sadistic spectacle of the brazen bull. This was no mere torture. It was a method of execution so unspeakably cruel that it's scarcely conceivable to the modern mind. The condemned would be locked inside a hollow brass statue of a bull, a fire then lit beneath its belly. As the metal grew scorching hot, the victim would be slowly roasted alive, their screams of agony echoing through the tubes and sounding like the bellowing of an enraged bull. It was said that the animal's horns would become red hot, searing and blistering the flesh of the victim as they writhed in helpless torment. The true horror of the brazen bull is perhaps best exemplified by the fate of its own inventor, the ancient Greek sculptor Perillos of Athens. According to legend, he presented his creation to the 6th century BC tyrant Phalaris as the ultimate means of executing criminals. Phalaris, a man renowned for his savage cruelty, was so impressed by the bull's ingenious design that he ordered Perillos to demonstrate its effectiveness on the spot by climbing inside it himself. As the screaming artisan was locked within his own creation and the pyre lit beneath him, Phalaris is said to have mocked him over the roar of the flames. "Nothing is as sweet as the screams of those who once planned my downfall," the tyrant sneered. He ordered the bull door unlatched, pulling the hideously burned Perillos from within and tossing his blistered body over a cliff for the sharks to devour, the final victim of his own twisted imagination. Though Perillos' tale is likely apocryphal, there's no denying the bull's brutality. It serves as a chilling embodiment of the depths of human sadism, the drive not only to kill, but to inflict the maximum possible suffering in the process. And in this regard, medieval executioners needed little inspiration from ancient Greek sculptors. They were every bit as adept at conjuring up ingenious new means to torment the condemned. But of all the gruesome methods of execution practiced in medieval Europe, few could match the sheer, visceral horror of being boiled alive. The concept is simple enough. Immerse the condemned in a cauldron of boiling water, oil, or even molten lead, and watch as they are scalded and cooked to death before a jeering crowd. But the actual logistics of the act and its effect on the human body are another matter entirely. The 13th century English outlaw William Harrison learned this firsthand when he was captured after a bungled robbery attempt and sentenced to be boiled alive for his crimes. As he was rowed out to the middle of a foul-smelling tannery to meet his fate, he had no concept of the torment that awaited him, only that it would be a welcome release from the squalor and violence of his life as a highwayman. But as William was forced at knife point to climb into the massive vat of boiling leather dye, the reality of his sentence came crashing down on him. The moment his legs plunged into the scalding liquid, the pain was beyond anything he had ever experienced. His skin immediately began to blister and peel away, exposing the raw, cooking flesh beneath. He screamed and thrashed against the hands holding him down, but it was useless. The more he struggled, the faster he slid into the vat, the boiling dye searing his skin and filling his lungs. The crowd roared with laughter and jeers as he disappeared beneath the surface, his agonized wails replaced by a sickening hiss and the stench of charring meat. Within minutes, William Harrison had been reduced to human stew, his body unrecognizable amidst the bits of floating fat and gristle. It was a spectacle as much as an execution, a vivid reminder to all who witnessed it of the price of crossing those in power. But not all deaths were quite so swift. When a 16th century poisoner by the name of Richard Roos was boiled alive in oil for his crimes, his executioners kept the temperature deliberately low, drawing out his torment for a full half hour. By the time he finally succumbed to his burns and suffocated on his own melted flesh, Onlookers described him as looking like a sloughed snake, floating in a cauldron of its own juices. Such was the grim irony of medieval justice, that those tasked with punishing the wicked so often embodied an even greater cruelty themselves. After all, what kind of society could not only condone such brutality, but revel in it as public entertainment? Perhaps no figure better exemplifies this hypocrisy than England's 15th century Lord High Executioner, Simon of Burton. A man renowned for his creative flair in conjuring up new and ever more sadistic means of dispatching the condemned, Simon took a perverse pride in his work, seeing himself as an artist as much as a servant of the law. His most infamous innovation was the so-called bird cage, an iron gibbet in which the condemned would be suspended in a kneeling position, their limbs contorted painfully behind their back. Trapped in this agonizing pose, they would be left to hang for days, even weeks, until exposure and exhaustion finally claimed them. The lucky ones went mad long before the end. Under Simon's watch, being drawn and quartered became a true art form, each stage of the grisly process meticulously choreographed for maximum suffering and spectacle. He took particular delight in refining the technique of castration, ensuring that his victims remained conscious as he slowly mutilated their most sensitive flesh. Yet for all his monstrous cruelty, Simon of Burton was a respected figure, admired by the public for his pious devotion to the crown and personal flair. He was said to recite scripture as he worked, seeing himself as an instrument of divine justice. When he finally succumbed to the plague in 1430, all of London mourned him as a fallen hero. It's a twisted irony, then, that the very last execution Simon presided over was that of a young apprentice who had been caught stealing a loaf of bread to feed his starving sister. As he watched the terrified boy being racked and drawn before the howling mob, Simon is said to have whispered a prayer for the salvation of his eternal soul. One has to wonder whether, at long last, a flicker of doubt finally crossed the executioner's merciless heart. But if Simon questioned the righteousness of his life's work, he gave no sign. To the end, he played his role in England's theatre of cruelty with all the relish and zeal of a true artist. His was a performance that would be echoed across the scaffolds and torture chambers of Europe for centuries to come, a testament to the savagery that lurks within the human heart, and the capacity for even the most monstrous deeds to be cloaked in the guise of justice. For in the end, is that not the true horror of medieval punishment? Not the mutilations, the brandings, the unspeakable torments, but the fact that they were carried out with the full blessings of the law and the church, in the name of order and morality. That the very institutions charged with safeguarding the people instead revelled in their suffering. It's a sobering reminder of the evil that can flourish when cruelty is enshrined as a virtue, and a warning that the distance between civilization and barbarism is far more fragile than we might like to believe. The ghosts of the drawn and quartered, the boiled and burned, cry out to us from history's shadows. A reminder that even the most brutal chapters of our past are never truly behind us. Their fates may read like a litany of horrors scarcely conceivable to the modern mind, but they were real people who suffered and died by a system that saw their torment as a public good. And for all the progress we have made since the days of the brazen bull and the birdcage, the spectre of sanctioned sadism still haunts the edges of our supposedly enlightened age. One need only glimpse inside a third world prison or a Guantanamo Bay interrogation cell to see that the spirit of the medieval dungeon is alive and well. The names and faces may have changed, but the fundamental impulse remains the same: to cloak savagery in the trappings of necessity and revel in the suffering of those we deem deserving. Yet even as we recoil from the worst excesses of medieval cruelty, There is a dark fascination that draws us to these tales of suffering and woe. Like the crowds that once gathered to cheer and jeer at the scaffold, we find ourselves morbidly compelled by the spectacle of human anguish laid bare. It's an impulse as old as history itself, the perverse thrill of bearing witness to the unthinkable. Perhaps in the end, that is the true enduring legacy of medieval punishment, not as a warning or a lesson, but as a mirror held up to the blackest depths of our own nature. For in the blood-soaked annals of history's darkest chapters, we catch a glimpse of the cruelty and perversion that lurks within us all, and the terrifying ease with which it can be unleashed in the name of righteousness. So let us gaze upon the brazen bull and shudder. Let us hear the screams of the boiled and shiver. But let us also remember that for all the horrors of the past, the capacity for such savagery lives on within the human heart, a dormant seed, waiting only for the right conditions to bloom anew. It falls to us, then, to be ever vigilant against the seductive lure of cruelty cloaked in the guise of justice. To remember that there is no righteousness in suffering, no redemption in pain. Only by facing the darkest chapters of our history head-on and recognizing them for the warnings they are, can we hope to build a future free from the shadow of the dungeon and the scaffold. For in the end, the ghosts of the drawn and quartered, the boiled and burned, cry out to us not for vengeance or retribution, but for remembrance. Theirs are the stories that history all too often forgets, the human faces behind the litany of atrocities. By honoring their memory and heeding the lessons of their suffering, we keep the flame of their humanity alive, and with it, the hope for a world where such horrors are only the stuff of fading nightmare. So as we've seen, the medieval approach to justice was often brutal, bizarre, and unforgiving. The crimes committed were met with an almost perverse creativity when it came to devising punishments that would inflict maximum suffering and humiliation. These spectacles served not only to torture the accused, but to send a grim message to all who witnessed them about the consequences of straying from the law or church doctrine. One particularly gruesome method of execution was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Reserved for the most serious crimes like high treason against the monarch, it was designed to be as agonizing and degrading as human imagination could concoct. The condemned would first be dragged behind a horse to the place of execution, a punishment in itself as the rough ground tore at their flesh. They were then hanged by the neck, but cut down just before death could claim them. What followed was an act of such savagery it's difficult to conceive. The still conscious victim would be disemboweled, their organs burned before their eyes. As a final indignity, they would be beheaded and their body cut into 4 pieces to be displayed as a warning to other would-be traitors. The first recorded instance of hanging, drawing and quartering dates back to 1241 during the reign of England's King Henry III. One of the most notable victims of this grisly ritual was the Welsh prince Dafydd ap Gruffudd, who dared to rebel against King Edward I in 1283. Dafydd's death was a slow, excruciating ordeal. After being dragged through the streets of Shrewsbury by a horse, he was hanged but cut down while still alive. His entrails were then cut out and burned before him as he watched, still clinging to life. Finally, he was beheaded and his body cut into 4 quarters, which were sent to be displayed in different parts of the country as a stark reminder of the price of treason. While hanging, drawing, and quartering was the ultimate punishment, another painful way to die was being boiled alive. In a large cauldron, the condemned would be submerged in boiling water, oil, tar, or even molten lead, slowly cooking to death in unimaginable agony. This brutal practice was used throughout Europe for crimes such as murder, heresy, and even counterfeiting. One of the most infamous cases of boiling as execution occurred in England in 1531. Richard Rose, a cook in the household of John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, was arrested for attempting to poison the bishop and his guests by adding a toxic substance to the yeast used in their porridge. Though Fisher survived, 2 of his servants died, and a number of visiting poor people fell severely ill. As poisoning was considered a form of treason, Rose's fate was sealed. He was publicly boiled to death at Smithfield, with contemporary accounts describing his agonized screams as he was lowered inch by inch into a scalding cauldron. A grim spectacle indeed, but one that the Tudor legal system deemed a necessary deterrent to strike fear into the hearts of any who might consider harming those in power. But it wasn't just the methods of execution that could be shockingly violent in the Middle Ages. Even lesser punishments for more minor crimes could be grisly and ruthless. Thievery, fraud, and public drunkenness might result in a spell in the pillory or stocks, where the offender would be locked into a wooden restraint in the town square and subjected to public ridicule and abuse. Passers-by could hurl rotten food, excrement, and insults at the unfortunate lawbreaker as they suffered the discomfort and degradation of their confinement. In some cases, the victims might even be subjected to branding, mutilation, or having their hands or ears cut off as an enduring mark of their criminality. Perhaps one of the most psychologically harrowing ordeals was the dreaded trial by ordeal, a method of determining guilt or innocence that left the ultimate judgment up to God. In the early Middle Ages, if there was not enough evidence to settle a case, the accused would be subjected to a painful and dangerous physical test, such as holding a red-hot iron, plunging their hand into boiling water, or being thrown bound into a lake or river. If they were innocent, the belief was that God would miraculously spare them from harm. But if they were burned, scalded, or drowned, it was taken as irrefutable proof of their guilt. One famous case of trial by ordeal involved the legendary English outlaw Hereward the Wake in the 11th century. Hereward was an Anglo-Saxon thane and the leader of local resistance to the Norman conquest of England. When he was finally captured and brought to trial, he was accused of murder and offered the chance to prove his innocence through ordeal. In a stunning display of either bravery or foolhardiness, Hereward chose to undergo the ordeal of hot iron, one of the most arduous of all. Miraculously, according to legend, he was able to carry the searing metal for the required 9 paces, and his hand showed no sign of burning, compelling the court to acquit him. Of course, trial by ordeal also had its vocal critics even in medieval times. In 1215, the Catholic Church banned priests from presiding over ordeals, and the practice began to fall out of favour as a reliable legal tool. After all, it essentially meant that the guilt or innocence of the accused came down to random chance, or worse, to how high or low their pain tolerance was. Unscrupulous authorities could even rig the results by heating the iron to different temperatures. The fact that a society could put so much faith in such a flawed and sadistic process speaks to the often superstitious medieval mindset and the emphasis placed on divine intervention in earthly affairs. As brutal as the punishments we've explored so far were, they paled in comparison to the horrific death dealt out by the brazen bull, a medieval torture and execution device as twisted as it was innovative. Originating in ancient Greece, the brazen bull was a hollow brass statue crafted in the shape of a bull, just large enough to contain a human being. The condemned would be placed inside the statue, and a fire lit beneath its belly, slowly heating the metal until the person inside roasted to death. As they screamed in agony, the acoustics of the bull's design would distort and amplify those sounds until they emerged sounding like the bellowing of an enraged bull. It was a punishment designed to be as poetic as it was cruel. According to legend, the brazen bull was invented in the 6th century BCE by a Greek metalsmith named Perillos, who presented his creation to Phalaris, the notoriously brutal tyrant of Acragas in Sicily. Perillos claimed that his device would deliver the perfect execution, an immersive death that would provide a terrifying spectacle for onlookers, while giving the condemned the honor of having their tortured screams transformed into bovine roars. Unimpressed, Phalaris decided to make Perillus the first victim of his own sadistic creation. The metalsmith was placed inside the brazen bull and roasted alive, with his screams of agony lending macabre life to his invention as he perished in unimaginable pain. Despite the ironic demise of its creator, the brazen bull went on to be used as an execution method in Greece and beyond for centuries. One of the most famous stories associated with the bull is that of the murder of Hannibal Lucchese, governor of Segesta in medieval Italy. Lucchese had developed a reputation for cruelty and misrule, extorting and terrorizing the populace. One day, after sentencing a citizen to death in the brazen bull on a whim, the desperate people of Segesta finally rose up against their tyrannical ruler. In a fitting twist of fate, they seized Lucchese and forced him inside the very instrument of death he had inflicted on so many others. As the coals roared to life and the brass heated to a searing glow, Lucchese's agonized wails echoed out into the streets, a grim swan song for a reign of terror that had finally come to an end. The brazen bull is a potent symbol of the depth of cruelty that humans are capable of inflicting on one another. Even in an era known for its grisly punishments, the bull stood out as a particularly chilling marriage of artistry and suffering, a torture device that aimed to transform death into dark spectacle. Its enduring infamy reminds us of the thin line that separates civilization from barbarism, and how easily societies can cross that line when consumed by fear, superstition, or the thirst for vengeance. But for sheer shock value, few punishments could match the visceral horror of the boats. A method of execution practiced in ancient Persia, the boat saw the offender trapped between two small rowboats or hollowed out tree trunks, with their head, hands, and feet protruding from this wooden prison. They would then be force-fed a mixture of milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, and more of the sticky sweet concoction would be smeared on their exposed body parts. What followed was a slow, nightmarish descent into agony and madness. Left to bake in the hot sun, the victim's filth-smeared skin would quickly become a magnet for flies, wasps, and other biting insects. As they lay there, unable to move or defend themselves, these pests would begin to eat and lay eggs in their flesh, slowly devouring them from the outside in. But this was only the start of their torment. The unrelenting diet of milk and honey would soon cause severe dehydration and diarrhea, leaving them to fester in their own waste. As the boats filled up with more and more of their excrement, the victim would become a literal breeding ground for maggots and vermin. In some cases, it could take over 2 weeks for the condemned to succumb to septic shock or dehydration. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch recounts one story of a Persian soldier who lasted an astonishing 17 days before finally expiring. Can you imagine a more fitting torment for the treacherous than to be consumed by the very land they betrayed? It's a potent reminder of the twisted creativity that humans can apply to the art of cruelty. The story of half-hanged Margaret Dixon offers a glimmer of dark hope amidst all this horror. In 1724, Margaret Dixon was a Scottish fish hawker who conceived a child out of wedlock. Terrified of the public scorn and destitution that single motherhood would bring down upon her, she secretly gave birth to the baby alone and abandoned it in the nearby town of Musselburgh. When the infant's body was discovered, Margaret was arrested for infanticide. In a trial that was stacked against her from the start, she was quickly convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. On the day of her execution, Margaret was led out before a huge, jeering crowd, the noose placed around her neck. The trapdoor opened and she plummeted down, dangling lifelessly at the end of the rope. She hung there for a full 30 minutes before being cut down and pronounced dead. Her limp body was bound in a shroud and placed in a coffin for transport back to her home village of Inveresk for burial. But as the cart trundled along the rough roads, the impossible happened. Margaret began to stir. At first, the driver of the cart was terrified, thinking he was witnessing a resurrection. But as Margaret let out a groan and started to struggle within her shroud, he realized that she must have somehow miraculously survived her execution. He quickly helped her out of her coffin and rushed her to the nearest tavern for care. News of half-hanged Maggie's miraculous survival spread like wildfire, and an angry mob descended on the town, suspicious that her escape from death was the work of witchcraft. But luck, it seems, was finally on Margaret's side. When the authorities looked into the matter, they came to the conclusion that the hanging had been botched and that no sorcery was at play. More importantly, they decided that Margaret had already served her sentence. She had quite literally been hanged to the point of death, as the law required. Executing her again would be akin to punishing her twice for the same crime. And so Margaret was allowed to go free, and she would go on to happily marry and have several more children, living to the astonishing age of 98. Margaret's story is a reminder of the slim hope that existed even in the face of medieval barbarism, that even in a time of cruelty and superstition, tiny cracks of justice and human empathy could still let the light in. Her unlikely survival speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the small miracles that could sometimes snatch a victim back from the jaws of a terrible fate. For most, though, once they were marked for death, only nightmares awaited. Perhaps no institution embodied this better than the Spanish Inquisition, a powerful office established by the Catholic Church in 1478 to maintain religious orthodoxy in Spain and its territories. Over the centuries that followed, the Inquisition would become a byword for spiritual terror and ruthless persecution, known for its use of torture, coerced confessions, and the auto da fe, the elaborate public ritual in which heretics would face their final judgment. The auto da fe, which means act of faith in medieval Spanish, was equal parts pageantry and horror. Throngs of spectators would gather in a public square to watch as those deemed guilty of religious crimes were paraded out, wearing elaborately decorated cone-shaped hats and robes covered in hellish images and mocking epithets. There, they would face a scathing sermon enumerating their spiritual failures before being handed over to the civil authorities for punishment. For those who recanted their heresies and begged for mercy, the sentence might be a humiliating public lashing or a period of imprisonment. But for the unrepentant, only one fate awaited: death by burning at the stake. Before a baying mob, they would be tied to a wooden post atop a pile of kindling, the pungent scent of oil-soaked wood filling their nostrils as hooded monks solemnly intoned Latin prayers for their immortal soul. Then, with a roar of flame, their searing agony would begin, sometimes dragging on for a horrific eternity as the fire slowly consumed their flesh. To the pious onlookers, it was a visceral reminder of the eternal hellfire that awaited those who strayed from the path of true faith. One of the most famous victims of the Inquisition's flames was the brilliant Spanish theologian and physician Michael Servetus. A true Renaissance man, Servetus made contributions to the study of geography, astrology, and medicine, even becoming one of the first Europeans to correctly describe the function of pulmonary circulation. But his restless intellect also led him to question some of the core doctrines of Orthodox Christianity, most notably the Trinitarian conception of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In 1553, Servetus published a book on reforming Christianity which caught the attention of the Inquisition. Arrested and found guilty of spreading heretical teachings, he was sentenced to be burned at the stake. On his final day, he was led out before a huge crowd in Geneva, the light of the pale sun mingling with the hellish glow of the waiting pyre. As the flames consumed him, Servetus could be heard crying out in agony, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me." His last words were a poignant blend of defiance and despair, a refusal to conform to the very end, and a very human pleading in the face of the ultimate cruelty. Servetus's execution sent shockwaves through Europe's intellectual community. Some, like the Protestant reformer John Calvin, saw it as a just punishment for the crime of religious subversion. Others, like the humanist Sebastian Castellio, were appalled by the killing of a man for daring to voice unorthodox ideas. The debate over Servetus's death would become a defining moment in the battle for freedom of thought and belief, a poignant symbol of the struggle between orthodoxy and those who yearn to move beyond the cruelty and rigid thinking of the past. And what of that cruelty? What are we to make of the unflinching brutality of the medieval mindset, of the elaborate tapestry of sadism and pain that defined the era's approach to justice and social control? It's tempting to look back and judge our ancestors harshly, to see them as barbaric, unenlightened, perhaps even evil. But to do so would be to ignore the context of the age in which they lived. For medieval Europeans, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. Death was an ever-present spectre, stalking the young and old alike in the form of war, famine, and plague. Violence and suffering were woven into the fabric of everyday existence, and the line between this world and the next often felt poignantly thin. In such an unforgiving landscape, is it any wonder that people clung to the certainties of religion and rigid social hierarchy, that they saw cosmic meaning in earthly agony and divine justice in cruel and pitiless punishments? More than that, though, the graphic public nature of medieval tortures and executions served a strategic purpose. In an age before mass media, before literacy was widespread, the spectacle of a criminal being broken on the wheel or boiled alive served as a visceral form of communication, a way of etching the consequences of transgression into the public consciousness through shock and revulsion. The twisted bodies and agonized screams of the condemned were a reminder of the social order, a warning to all who might consider straying from the path of righteousness. And yet, even in the depths of all, as the medieval period progressed, the punishments inflicted upon criminals seemed to only grow more severe and elaborate. One of the most feared and cruel methods of execution was known as hanging, drawing, and quartering. Reserved for the most serious crime of high treason against the crown, this grisly practice was as much a symbolic destruction of the offender as it was a brutal public spectacle. The unfortunate soul condemned to this fate would first be dragged behind a horse from their place of imprisonment to the site of execution, often over rough cobblestones that would leave them battered and bloodied before they even reached the gallows. Once there, they would be hanged by the neck, but cut down just before death could claim them. This was intentional, as the true agonies were yet to come. Next, the nearly unconscious victim would be disemboweled alive, their entrails yanked out and burned before their eyes. The hot, searing pain and the reek of their own burning viscera was said to be enough to jolt them back to grim awareness. But even this heinous act was still not the finale of their torment. Lastly, they would be beheaded and their body hacked into 4 pieces, a process known as quartering. This was a very literal division of the traitor's remains, with the head and quarters often displayed publicly at the city gates or sent to the far corners of the realm as a warning to other would-be rebels. It sent an unmistakable message. Betrayal would be punished with the utmost severity, and one's remnants would be scattered to the winds. One of the most famous cases of hanging, drawing, and quartering was that of William Wallace, the Scottish knight and landowner who became a leader during the Wars of Scottish Independence. Immortalised in the film Braveheart, Wallace was a thorn in the side of English King Edward I, waging a guerrilla war against English rule in Scotland. Captured and charged with treason, Wallace was subjected to this horrific execution in London in 1305. His crime? Fighting for Scottish freedom against an English sovereign he refused to recognise. Wallace endured the agony of being hanged, drawn, and quartered with legendary courage, remaining defiant to the last. His quartered body was displayed in towns across Scotland as a gruesome warning, but he would live on as a martyr for Scottish independence. The violence of Wallace's execution, even by the brutal standards of the time, spoke to how seriously medieval monarchs took treason and any threat to their power. Such torturous deaths were intended as visceral demonstrations of the crown's authority and the grave price of defiance. Yet in Wallace's case, Edward I's attempt to destroy him only ensured his fame would endure for centuries. Even more chilling than the spectacle of public executions like hanging, drawing, and quartering were the more shadowy, secret torments that took place deep in the dungeons of medieval castles. One of the most blood-curdling was the method known simply as boiling alive. As the name suggests, the condemned would be immersed into a large cauldron or vat of boiling liquid, usually water, oil, or even molten lead for the most serious crimes. The liquid would be heated to a furious rolling boil, ensuring an agonizing, scalding death as the victim thrashed and screamed until they finally succumbed. It's hard to imagine a more excruciating way to die. This horrific practice was used across Europe for crimes such as murder, poisoning, coin counterfeiting, and even boiling someone else to death. The irony of punishing one boiling with another was apparently lost on medieval courts. Executions by boiling were often done in public squares to maximize their impact as a deterrent. Take the case of John Rous, the cook of the Bishop of Rochester, who was boiled alive at London's Smithfield in 1531. Rose had been convicted of poisoning the porridge at the bishop's palace, resulting in 2 deaths and several illnesses. It mattered little that Rose claimed it was an accident. The cruel wheel of medieval justice had already creaked into motion. After being dragged to a 10-gallon cauldron on a vast pile of wooden faggots, Rose was chained and hanged over the vat from a gibbet as the fire was lit. As the water bubbled and steamed, he was lowered in gradually, first to his waist, then to his neck. Witnesses describe his agonized screams echoing off the buildings of Smithfield Market as his skin reddened and blistered before he finally succumbed. The onlookers that flocked to watch Rose boil were apparently enthusiastic. So outraged were they by his betrayal of the bishop's trust. His execution, though stomach-churning, was seen as just desserts for tainting food with poison. In an age where illness was poorly understood and medical care rudimentary at best, poisoners were especially reviled and feared. However, not all cases of boiling were quite so clear-cut in their guilt. The 16th century English herbalist and midwife Agnes Sampson was accused of witchcraft and implicated in a plot to kill King James VI of Scotland. Subjected to horrific torture on the rack in Scotland's Holyrood House Castle, she was soon put into the Cashilawis, an iron frame that suspended her above a fire while her body was prodded with hot tongs. Sampson broke under this ghastly torment and confessed to outlandish crimes of sorcery and devil worship. She was then garroted and burned at the stake. Though it's likely the only magic she dabbled in were the herbal remedies common to wise women of the time. Her case showcases how brutality could lead to false confessions elicited under duress. From the elaborate public rituals of hanging, drawing, and quartering, to the stomach-churning boiling alive of poisoners and suspected witches in castle dungeons, the most extreme capital punishments of the medieval era shock us with their cruelty and barbarity today. Yet for the lawmen and rulers of the time, such torturous methods were a way to control a population through fear and spectacle. The bloodier and more visible, the better. These execution methods also reveal much about what medieval societies feared most: betrayal from within, whether by traitorous nobles, treacherous servants, or cunning poisoners. Such intimate threats had to be destroyed in the most graphic ways imaginable to send an unmistakable message. The agony inflicted was a visceral reminder of the sovereign's awesome and terrible power. Yet history also whispers of tragic figures like William Wallace or Agnes Simpson, whose brutal ends often only reinforce the injustices of their persecutions. The line between punishment and cruelty, justice and barbarity has never been murkier than in the medieval era. These dark chapters of history may make us wince, but they also offer sobering insight into the human capacity for both sadism and survival in the face of unspeakable torment. So the next time you shudder at a shadowy torture chamber or execution square in a castle or museum, remember the stories of the condemned. Their suffering may be centuries past, but their experiences still have much to teach us about the human condition and the slow, fitful progression of justice across the ages. The blood has long since been scrubbed away, but the memories of hanging, drawing, quartering, and boiling linger, a macabre testament to a harsher time. Yet even in an age of such normalized brutality, there were still punishments that stood out as especially bizarre and shocking. In the next section, we'll explore some of the most outlandish sentences handed down by the medieval courts, from strangulation followed by drowning, to being devoured alive between two boats. Believe it or not, it gets even stranger. But for now, as the fading screams of the drawn and quartered echo across the dreamscape of your imagination, let yourself drift off into the murky mists of history. There may be uneasy visions of bubbling cauldrons and severed heads awaiting you there, but take comfort in the distance we've come since such horrors were a waking reality. Sleep now, and remember, there but for the grace of progress go you or I. As we've seen, the creative cruelty of medieval punishments knew few bounds. From the agonizing pain of the rack to the public spectacles of whipping, branding, and the stocks, medieval justice revolved around brutal deterrence and religious notions of suffering as penance for sin. One of the most infamous torture devices of the Middle Ages was the brazen bull, a hollow brass statue in the shape of a bull, just large enough to contain a human victim. The condemned would be locked inside the brass belly of the beast and a fire lit beneath it, slowly heating the metal until the person inside roasted to death. As the screaming victim succumbed to the searing heat, the acoustic design of the bull converted their cries into a haunting sound, like the lowing of an angry ox. Legend has it that the brazen bull was invented by a clever Greek metalworker named Perilos in the 6th century BC. Hoping to gain favor with the notorious tyrant Phalaris of Sicily, Perilos proudly presented his cruel creation to the despot, expecting to be richly rewarded. Phalaris, however, was disgusted by this device designed solely for torture. In a grim example of poetic justice, he ordered that Perilos become the first victim to be roasted alive inside his own brazen bull. Though spared a full execution, the inventor nonetheless suffered severe burns and ultimately was thrown off a cliff by Phalaris. However, Phalaris soon put the brazen bull to use against his many political enemies. A notable victim was a man named Perillo, unrelated to the bull's designer, who was convicted of murder. Perillo was sentenced to be boiled alive inside the terrible brazen contraption as crowds gathered to witness his demise. From inside the bull, Perillo's agonized wails became distorted into bovine bellows, a nightmarish sound that echoed through the city. When the bull was finally opened and the charred corpse removed, the disfigured death mask of Perillo was said to be frozen in a rictus of unspeakable suffering. While the brazen bull originated in ancient Greece, the cruel concept spread and resurfaced in various medieval kingdoms. The 12th century monarch of Sicily, William I, was reputed to have used a brazen bull. In medieval Spain, during the dark days of the Inquisition, descriptions of a torture device called the bronze steer arose, in which heretics were forced inside a hollow bronze calf and a fire lit underneath, slowly burning them alive. Whether directly inspired by the ancient device of pariahs or dreamed up independently by medieval minds, the brazen bull epitomized the sadistic ingenuity of pre-modern punishments. If roasting alive inside a metal effigy wasn't horrible enough, the Middle Ages had plenty of other ghastly execution methods designed to inflict maximum suffering. In England, the worst punishments were reserved for treason against the crown, as in the shockingly brutal practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The death of Dafydd ap Gruffydd, Prince of Wales, in 1283, vividly illustrates the cruelty of this execution method reserved for enemies of the English monarchy. After leading a failed rebellion against King Edward I, Dafydd ap Gruffydd was captured and condemned as a traitor to the most severe punishment England could inflict. First, he was dragged behind a horse to the site of his public execution, a symbolic ritual meant to subject him to humiliation and pain. Then, Dafydd was hanged by the neck from a gallows, but cut down while still alive. In the most grisly stage of the execution, he was disemboweled, having his entrails drawn out and burned before his eyes. Finally, his heart was cut out, his body decapitated, and the remains sliced into 4 quarters. The fate of Dafydd ap Gruffydd served as a stark warning to any who would defy the authority of the English crown. Each step of the hideous execution ritual, the drawing, hanging, evisceration, and quartering, was calculated to maximize the victim's physical and psychological anguish, turning death into a slow, torturous process. The practice of hanging, drawing, and quartering would remain the ultimate penalty for high treason in England for centuries, a terrifying prospect, even in an age when brutal punishments were commonplace. Almost as painful to contemplate was the grim fate of being boiled alive. In 1531, this is exactly what happened to Richard Roos, the cook of the Bishop of Rochester in Kent, England. Rose was arrested and convicted of attempting to poison the bishop and his guests by adding a toxic substance to the porridge he prepared. 2 of the bishop's attendants died after eating the poisoned dish, though the bishop himself hadn't touched it. Appalled by this betrayal and the loss of life, King Henry VIII wanted to make an example of Rose. In an unprecedented move, Parliament rushed through a special law, the Act for Poisoning, to allow boiling as an execution method for murder through poison. Just 1 month after the crime, Rose became the first person in England to be boiled to death under the new legislation. Contemporary accounts describe the horrifying spectacle of Rose being suspended by ropes over a cauldron of boiling water. He was repeatedly lowered in and hoisted out, prolonging the agony as the scalding water seared the flesh from his bones. By the time he finally succumbed, his body had been boiled apart, the fat separating from the flesh and the muscles sloughing off. It was an unspeakably dreadful way to die. Though Rose's case was the only time the Act for Poisoning was actually applied in England, the punishment of boiling alive cropped up in various forms throughout medieval Europe. Some countries boiled criminals in water, while others used boiling oil, molten lead, or even boiling wax. The French had a punishment called the cauldron used for counterfeiters and coin forgers, where they'd be immersed in scalding water or oil. The visual horror and visceral physicality of death by boiling made it an especially traumatic sentence to witness, even in an age desensitized to brutal violence as public spectacle. Nonetheless, the threat of being boiled alive was wielded by medieval authorities to inspire terror and absolute obedience in their subjects. So while the brazen bull, boiling cauldron, and dismemberment at the gallows might sound like the elaborate tortures of history's cruelest despots, they were all too real features of the medieval European justice system. The dark human fascination with inflicting pain found an eager outlet in these and so many other cruel and unusual punishments. And we've still barely scratched the surface of the bizarre world of medieval justice. As we've seen, the punishments meted out in medieval times were often unimaginably cruel, designed to inflict maximum suffering and to serve as a stark warning to others. But the cruelty wasn't random. There was a twisted logic to it all, a belief that the severity of the punishment should match the severity of the crime. Theft might warrant a hand being chopped off, while treason could bring the agonizing death of being hanged, drawn and quartered. One of the most notorious examples of this brutal calculus of crime and punishment was the case of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 14th century England. Despenser was a close advisor and alleged lover of King Edward II, and his rapid rise to power and ruthless greed made him many enemies among the nobility. When Edward's Queen Isabella led a successful rebellion against the king in 1326, Despenser found himself at her mercy, and she showed him none. Isabella had Despenser tried and convicted of treason, theft, and other crimes against the realm. His sentence was designed to be as agonizing and humiliating as possible. First, he was stripped naked, and biblical verses about corruption and deceit were scrawled on his skin. Then, he was dragged behind 4 horses to the place of execution, where a jeering crowd awaited. There, he was hung from a 50-foot gallows, but cut down before he could choke to death. As he lay dazed and in agony, his executioners set upon him. They hacked off his genitals and threw them into a fire, then sliced open his abdomen and yanked out his entrails and heart, which were also tossed into the flames. Finally, his corpse was beheaded and cut into 4 pieces, which were mounted on spikes and displayed across London as a warning to other traitors. It was a horrific end, even by the grim standards of the time. While the fates of people like Despenser and other victims of brutal medieval punishments might seem impossibly distant to us today, what's more unsettling is how long these practices endured. The last hanging, drawing, and quartering in England took place in 1782, and France's final execution by breaking on the wheel happened as late as 1835. Change came, but it came slowly. And even as the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and early modern period, the creativity and cruelty of punishments in many ways only seemed to grow. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century unleashed a new wave of religious persecution and sectarian violence. Both Catholics and Protestants enthusiastically burned heretics at the stake and devised even more elaborate means of torture to root out hidden enemies of the faith. One particularly grisly execution method that gained popularity in the 1500s was the so-called Nuremberg funnel. This was reserved for habitual drunkards who were seen as a scourge on society. The offender would be chained to a table with a funnel forced down his throat. Huge quantities of liquid, usually wine, but sometimes raw sewage or boiling water, would be poured into the funnel until the victim's stomach burst. It was an agonizing and humiliating way to die, and a terrifying deterrent to would-be drunks. Blasphemers faced similarly inventive punishments. In the 16th century Spain, those convicted of blasphemy often had their tongues cut out with hot pincers before being strangled to death. In England, a common penalty was the pillory, but with a horrific twist. The victim would be locked into the wooden restraint and an iron cage fastened around their head. Then, their ears would be nailed to the pillory and shorn off with a razor. If they survived this mutilation, they would be forever marked as a blasphemer. As brutal as these punishments were, many at the time justified them as necessary to maintaining order in an inherently sinful and unruly world. Pain was the price of justice, and no price was too high to keep society on the righteous path. The fact that the laws and punishments fell so heavily on the poor and powerless while the wealthy could often buy their way out of consequences, rarely seemed to trouble those in charge. It would take a sea change in attitudes, brought on by the Enlightenment thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries, to slowly chip away at this edifice of cruelty. Reformers like the Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria, who argued that punishments should be proportionate to crimes and that torture and execution were inhumane relics of a barbarous age, slowly gained traction. Rulers like the Holy Roman Empress Maria Theresa and Britain's King George III began to outlaw cruel and unusual punishments and to standardize criminal sentences. But the old ways died hard. Many Enlightenment philosophers, like Voltaire, still defended harsh punishments and the death penalty as necessary deterrence. The French Revolution brought the terror of the guillotine to thousands, and in Britain, even as the number of capital crimes slowly decreased, crowds still thronged to see public hangings well into the 1800s, eager for the spectacle of a criminal getting their just deserts. It's a sobering reminder of how thin the veneer of civilization can be, and of the darkness that lurks in the human heart. The fact that for centuries, those in power could devise such imaginative torments, and citizens could cheer on such barbarity, sometimes in the very name of justice and righteousness, should give us pause. We might recoil in horror at the brutality of medieval punishments today. But would our ancestors be any less appalled by the state-sanctioned cruelties that still take place in our own time, whether it's solitary confinement, torture, or the death penalty? There's no easy answer. But as we contemplate the grim pageant of history, perhaps the most fitting tribute we can pay to the victims of these bygone punishments is to strive for a society where cruelty is never again mistaken for justice, where compassion outweighs retribution, and even the most lost and broken among us are seen as human beings worthy of dignity, rather than sinners to be scourged and destroyed. It's a struggle that each generation must take up anew, but in doing so, we help lay the slow, painstaking groundwork for a more just and humane world. And yet, even as we work towards that brighter future, the past remains with us, a shadow that can never fully be escaped. In museums and churches and crumbling fortresses across Europe, the relics of the medieval justice system still linger like ghosts. Thumbscrews, iron maidens, racks, judges' gavels worn smooth by generations of condemnation. Grim reminders of the darkness that once reigned, and that still whispers to us from the void. Perhaps that's why we find these old punishments so endlessly fascinating, even as they repel us. They're a window into the strange and haunted psyche of our species, with its capacity for both boundless mercy and unfathomable cruelty. A reminder of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. And though we might shudder at the thought of ending up on the wrong side of medieval justice, there's a strange comfort in knowing that no matter how bleak things seem, our ancestors endured and overcame far worse. So let the ghastly parade of the pillory and the branding iron, the rack and the wheel, march through your dreams tonight. Let them be a testament to the trials our forebears faced, and to the small, everyday triumphs of civilization over barbarism that we too often take for granted. And in the morning, perhaps spare a thought for those long ago victims whose suffering echoes down to us through the ages. May they rest in peace, and may we never forget the hard-won lessons of their lives and deaths. As the turbulent medieval period progressed, the ways in which societies punished criminals became increasingly inventive and extreme. Perhaps no methods were more dreaded than the gruesome torture devices conjured up in the darkest corners of the human imagination. The rack was one of the most widely used instruments of torture throughout medieval Europe. The concept was brutally simple. The victim would be stretched out on a large wooden frame by ropes tied to their wrists, and ankles. As the ropes were steadily pulled tighter and tighter, the limbs would be wrenched apart, causing excruciating pain as the joints and ligaments reached their breaking point. The agony could continue for hours or even days as the torturer attempted to elicit a confession or information. Death on the rack was not uncommon, whether from the unbearable pain or the eventual dislocation and tearing of vital organs. But perhaps even more chilling was a device known as the brazen bull. Originating in ancient Greece, this hollow brass statue in the shape of a bull was designed for a uniquely agonizing form of execution. The condemned would be locked inside the brass beast and a fire lit beneath it, slowly roasting them alive. As the metal walls heated to scorching temperatures, the victim's screams would echo through a complex system of tubes and bellows, becoming distorted into sounds that resembled the lowing of an infuriated bull. The twisted tale of the brazen bull's inception speaks to the cruel ingenuity behind it. According to legend, it was first proposed to the 6th century BC tyrant Phalaris by a metalworker named Perillos of Athens. Describing his concept for the human incinerating hell bull, Perillos promised that the screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowings. Intrigued, yet disgusted, Phalaris ordered the brazen bull be built and for Perillos to be its first victim, as a morbid test of his own device. The metalworker was duly locked inside and roasted alive, his wailing supplications transformed into bovine howls by his own acoustic design. Although the brazen bull was blessedly rare compared to other instruments of torture, the mere thought of being burned alive inside a metal prison was enough to strike terror into the medieval psyche. Indeed, the fear of fire was pervasive in a time when the flames of hell seemed all too real. Execution by burning was thus reserved for some of the most serious offences, such as heresy, treason, and witchcraft. No episode captures the dread of death by fire more vividly than the gruesome execution of the English royal cook John Rous in 1531. Rose had been convicted of attempted regicide after several dinner guests at the Bishop of Rochester's palace fell violently ill from a batch of poisoned porridge he had prepared. 2 died in agony, though the intended target, Bishop John Fisher, had been spared by his penchant for fasting. For his crime, Rose was sentenced to be boiled alive, lowered by ropes into a cauldron of boiling liquid in front of a large crowd at London's Smithfield. The chronicle of Tudor poet Thomas Deloney relates the horrifying spectacle. The fire was lighted, the water did seethe, and the cook was put into the boiling cauldron, which we may suppose was a dreadful torment, for that he cried mightily as was heard by a great number of people. Howbeit he escaped the death, by reason that the water was not throughly sod, wherewith they took him out, and did put him to a worser torment, for they bound him to a stake, and roasted him to death. Medieval execution was a form of macabre theatre, meant to strike awe and terror into onlookers' hearts. But perhaps no death sentence epitomized this twisted marriage of suffering and spectacle more than the infamous punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Reserved as the ultimate penalty for the foulest act of treason, it was deliberately designed to be as prolonged and agonizing as human cruelty could imagine. The first recorded instance comes from the year 1283, when the Welsh rebel prince Dafydd ap Gruffydd faced the wrath of England's King Edward I for his role in an uprising. Contemporary chronicler Geoffrey of Shrewsbury clinically described how Dafydd was dragged behind a horse to the gallows, where he was hanged by the neck, but cut down while still alive. In the throes of suffocation, his body was sliced open and his entrails yanked out and burned before his eyes. Finally, he was beheaded and his torso hacked into 4 quarters, to be displayed across the realm as a warning to other would-be traitors. From then on, hanging, drawing, and quartering became the go-to death sentence for male traitors in England for centuries to come. As medieval society grew both more powerful and more paranoid, the grim spectacles of executions became increasingly elaborate and theatrical. Raised wooden platforms called scaffolds allowed eager crowds a better view of the traitor's final agonies. The prolonged torture of half-hanging and disemboweling was thought to give the condemned a final chance to repent for his betrayal and save his immortal soul before the axe fell. One of the most dramatic cases was that of Sir William Wallace, the Scottish knight and guerrilla leader who led a spirited resistance against English rule in the early 14th century. After his forces were crushed at the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace spent years on the run before being captured and hauled to London to answer for his rebellion. In a trial that was little more than a formality, he was convicted of treason and sentenced to a traitor's death at Smithfield. Matthew Paris, a monk and chronicler, recorded the grisly details of Wallace's execution on August 23, 1305. First, he was drawn asunder by horses, Paris wrote, then hanged on a high gallows, and while still alive, his entrails were drawn out and burnt in a fire, and finally he was beheaded and quartered, and the parts sent to the four corners of Scotland. The English made sure Wallace's head was impaled on a spike at London Bridge, an unmistakable message to anyone else who dared defy the Crown's authority. Yet even in death, William Wallace would become a towering symbol of Scotland's long struggle for independence against its larger southern neighbour. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, his legend only grew, a stirring reminder that brutal displays of power were not always enough to crush the defiant spirit of rebels and martyrs. Indeed, for all the medieval world's fascination with increasingly ingenious and agonizing ways to punish criminals, the effectiveness of such torture and terror was questionable. Crimes like theft, assault, and even murder remained stubbornly common, suggesting that the threat of slow death was not quite the foolproof deterrent authorities hoped. If anything, the looming scaffold may have only hardened the hearts of the most desperate wrongdoers, pushing them to further extremes. Moreover, the arbitrary cruelty of medieval justice frequently saw the innocent suffer alongside the guilty, as the scales of judgment were too often tipped by wealth, status, and sheer luck. A woman accused of witchcraft might be burned at the stake on the flimsiest of evidence, while a well-connected knight could literally get away with murder. The inequality was such that by 1215, the Magna Carta saw fit to enshrine the right to due process, decreeing that no free man is to be arrested, or imprisoned, or disseised, or outlawed, or exiled, or in any other way ruined, nor will we go against him or send against him, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. Of course, the impartiality of justice remained an elusive ideal, subject to the whims of rulers, the prejudices of the powerful, and the superstitions of the age. Punishments that to modern eyes seem almost comically cruel persisted for centuries more, as much for their value as public spectacle as for any real benefit to the social order. Yet, as medieval Europe gave way to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the tide slowly began to turn against the worst excesses of torture and brutality. Thinkers like Voltaire and Cesare Beccaria argued that such inhumane punishments were not only barbaric, but ineffective and counterproductive. Imprisonment, rehabilitation, and more standardized sentencing gradually replaced mutilation and execution as the preferred tools of criminal justice. Still, echoes of the Middle Ages linger in our collective psyche, surfacing in our fascination with tales of dungeons and executions, rebel heroes and pitiless tyrants. The human imagination, for better or worse, cannot help but be drawn to the darkest expressions of power and suffering, perhaps as a reminder of our own capacity for both cruelty and resilience in the face of it. So the next time you find yourself transfixed by a grim story of some medieval miscreant facing a horrific fate, remember the lesson at the heart of all those chilling punishments: that justice, for all its high-minded ideals, is an eternally human endeavor, as fallible and ingenious as the souls who strain to enact it. The true reckoning is not with the judged, but the judges, and the civilization that empowers them to decide which acts are beyond the pale. To condemn the brutality of the past is easy, but to ask what cruelties we tolerate in our own time, well, that is the harder and more vital question. As the medieval period progressed, justice continued to be dispensed through a combination of religious doctrine, royal decrees, and local customs. The result was a patchwork of punishments that could vary widely from place to place and case to case. But amid all the inconsistency, one thread remained constant: the belief that severe, often public, punishments were necessary to maintain order and morality in society. One of the most feared and reviled forms of medieval punishment was torture. While torture had been used since ancient times to extract confessions and information from the accused, the medieval period saw it refined into a grim art form. The rack, as mentioned earlier, was a particularly dreaded torture device. Victims would be stretched out on a wooden frame by ropes attached to their wrists and ankles. As the ropes were steadily tightened by a lever and pulley system, the victims' joints would be painfully dislocated and their muscles torn. In some cases, the torment could go on for hours as interrogators demanded confessions or information. But the rack was far from the only tool in the medieval torturer's repertoire. Another particularly gruesome device was known as the brazen bull. This hollow brass sculpture, usually crafted in the shape of a bull, would be heated by a fire lit beneath its belly. The condemned would then be placed inside the scorching metal chamber, their screams of agony echoing out through tubes cleverly designed to sound like the bellowing of an enraged bull. It was a punishment as psychologically disturbing as it was physically agonizing. One of the most infamous cases of death by brazen bull occurred in the 6th century BCE Greece. According to legend, a master metalworker named Perillos presented his newly forged brazen bull to Phalaris, the notoriously cruel tyrant of Akragas. Perillos boasted that his device would allow Phalaris to extract the ultimate vengeance on his enemies while being serenaded by their tortured wails. But Phalaris, it seemed, had a morbidly ironic streak. To test the brazen bull's effectiveness, he ordered Perillos himself to be locked inside his own creation and roasted alive. As the metalworker's shrieks rang out, transformed into bovine bellows, Phalaris was said to have remarked that the brazen bull's first victim had played his part admirably. However, in a final twist, Phalaris had Perillos removed before death and hurled from a cliff, deeming him too vile to receive a proper burial. While the tale of Perillos and his brazen bull may be semi-mythical, it certainly reflects the pitiless ingenuity that went into medieval torture devices and the harsh caprice with which justice could be meted out. But torture, for all its brutality, was just one shade on the spectrum of medieval punishments. In many cases, death itself was deemed the only suitable sentence. But there were a myriad of ways one could be put to death in the Middle Ages. Perhaps the most iconic medieval execution method was being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Reserved for the most serious offence of high treason against the monarch, this grisly punishment involved the victim being dragged or drawn behind a horse to the place of execution, then publicly hanged by the neck until nearly dead. But that was just the beginning of their torments. While still alive and at least semi-conscious, they would be cut open and their entrails removed or drawn out. The intestines would often be tossed into a fire, symbolically damning the traitor's soul. Finally, the body would be beheaded and chopped into 4 quarters, with the head and quarters frequently displayed in prominent locations as a gory warning to other would-be traitors. It was a slow, excruciating, and tremendously bloody way to die, with the public spectacle a key part of the punishment. Another particularly nasty execution method was boiling alive. In this punishment, the condemned would be submerged into a large cauldron filled with boiling water, oil, or even molten lead in extreme cases. Death could take anywhere from a few minutes to a few agonizing hours, depending on the temperature of the liquid and how quickly the executioners worked. While the image of a witch being boiled in her cauldron is a common fairy tale trope, in reality, boiling was often reserved for poisoners and coin forgers, whose crimes were seen as an especially unnatural perversion of normal human acts. After all, what could be more fitting for a poisoner than to stew in their own toxic brew? One of England's last recorded cases of boiling as execution took place in 1531. The perpetrator was Richard Roos, a cook in the household of the Bishop of Rochester. Roos was arrested and convicted of attempted murder after several of the bishop's guests fell violently ill with food poisoning, with 2 ultimately dying. Roos confessed to poisoning a batch of porridge with a toxic white powder, though he claimed his intent had been to play a practical joke rather than to kill. Unamused, the courts condemned him to be boiled to death without the benefit of clergy, as a medieval chronicler put it. Being denied the benefit of clergy meant that Roos, as a lowly cook, could not plead literacy and holy orders to escape the ultimate penalty as a more high-born poisoner might. So, Roos met his unpleasant end in a bubbling cauldron at London's notorious Smithfield execution grounds. The Bishop of Rochester himself was said to attend the execution, no doubt gratified to see the treacherous cook get his just deserts. In the aftermath of Roos's crime, Henry VIII passed a special law making poisoning a form of treason punishable by boiling, though he later repealed it in favour of hanging for all poisoners regardless of status. Compared to boiling or being drawn and quartered, simple beheading by sword or axe could almost seem a mercy. Traditionally, a nobler form of execution, beheading was often reserved for aristocratic criminals or defeated enemy commanders. Done with a single strong blow, it was relatively quick and presumably less painful than many of the alternatives. However, a clumsy headsman could easily botch the job, hacking awkwardly at the neck, or even missing altogether in a gory spectacle. Moreover, there has long been speculation that a severed head might retain consciousness for several seconds, meaning that the executed could perceive their own decapitation. While the scientific jury is still out on that macabre notion, it only adds to the aura of dread and mystery that attended beheadings in the medieval mind. But not all medieval punishments were capital, and not all were officially sanctioned. More informal penalties abounded for petty crimes and social transgressions. A common example was the cucking stool, a seat attached to a lever that could be used to repeatedly dunk a person underwater. Most frequently deployed against unruly women and suspected scolds, it was a punishing, non-fatal alternative to burning witches. Similarly, the brank or scold's bridle aimed to restrain loose tongues by quite literally bridling them with a locking metal cage. Some branks even featured an interior spike to stab the tongue should the wearer attempt to speak. While rarely fatal, these devices mark the offender out for public ridicule and could cause lasting pain and humiliation. So as you can see, the medieval approach to justice was not exactly a gentle one. From unofficial shaming tactics to elaborate tortures and spectacular executions, punishments were designed to not only match, but exceed the crime's severity. They were harsh deterrents to keep a lid on the violence and chaos bubbling just below the surface of medieval life. Yet amid all the cruelty, there are some truly bizarre cases that strain modern credulity. Consider the rat torture, a punishment apparently dreamed up by a 17th century jailer in the German town of Chell. The restrained prisoner would have a rat trapped in a metal cage against their bare stomach. The cage would then be slowly heated, driving the rat to burrow into the prisoner's guts in a desperate attempt to escape. It's unclear how frequently this particularly sadistic torture was used, but it speaks to the dark creativity of the medieval punitive imagination. Slightly less grisly, but no less strange, was the German punishment of strangulation followed by drowning imposed on women convicted of infanticide. The grim logic seemed to be that strangulation would prevent the soul from escaping through the mouth as the body drowned, damning it to eternal unrest. Again, how often this particular combination was actually employed is lost to history, but it illustrates the dreadful specificity of some medieval punishments. Speaking of unusually specific punishments, ancient Persia's boat's penalty deserves a mention. In this slow and agonizing form of execution, the condemned would be trapped between two rowboats or hollowed-out tree trunks, with their head, hands, and feet protruding. They would then be force-fed milk and honey until they developed diarrhea, attracting insects. As the victim lay stewing in their own filth, the bugs would eat them alive over a period of days or even weeks. While the boats may have faded from use by the medieval period, that level of sadistic creativity sadly lived on. Many punishments were tailored to fit the crime in perversely poetic ways. A medieval German coin forger might be boiled in oil like the false coins he forged. A thief might have a hand amputated. A person who bore false witness could have their tongue cut out. The idea was to let the punishment reflect the crime while permanently marking the criminal and preventing them from reoffending. But what if the offender was one of God's own representatives on earth? Members of the clergy were typically exempt from secular courts, being tried instead by church authorities under canon law. Punishments for wayward priests and monks tended to be less bloody than their civilian counterparts, usually focusing more on repentance than retribution. An adulterous priest might be sent on a penitential pilgrimage or sentenced to a lengthy period of ritual fasting and prayer. For more severe offences, they could be confined to a monastery or ejected from holy orders altogether. But in general, the Church reserved its harshest punishments for religious rather than common crimes: heresy, blasphemy, devil worship. These were the crimes that kept medieval inquisitors up at night. And to combat them, men of God had to get creative. In 1184, the Catholic Church formally outlined its policy on the prosecution of heresy in a papal bull chillingly titled Ad abolendam, or for the purpose of doing away with. It condoned stripping the convicted of property, rights, and even life in an effort to stamp out dissent. Mere centuries later, the Spanish Inquisition would take that mandate and run with it, creating one of the most notorious persecutory machines in history. Under the Spanish Inquisition, those accused of straying from Catholic doctrine could be subjected to all manner of torments to extract confessions, from stretching on the rack to having their feet roasted over a fire. Penitent heretics might escape with a humiliating public shaming at best, or a term of perpetual imprisonment at worst. But the unrepentant faced a spectacularly grim fate: death by auto da fe, or act of faith. These elaborate public rituals saw the condemned paraded before jeering crowds in conical dunce caps, before being tied to a stake and burned alive. The goal was not just to execute the heretic, but to break them utterly first, forcing them to accept the Church's authority with their dying breath. One of the tragic victims of this inflexible religious ideology was the Spanish physician and theologian Michael Servetus. A true Renaissance man, Servetus made contributions to everything from mathematics to meteorology. But his writings on Reformed Christianity, which questioned the Trinity and infant baptism, caught the attention of the Inquisition. Servetus managed to escape Spain and the clutches of the Catholic inquisitors, but he made the mistake of passing through the Swiss city of Geneva, a stronghold of Protestant reformer John Calvin. Though Calvin and Servetus had once been friendly correspondents, the theologian took grave offense to the heretical views outlined in Servetus's book, The Restoration of Christianity. At Calvin's urging, the Geneva City Council had Servetus arrested, tried for heresy, and condemned to death. Calvin argued for a more merciful beheading, but the council insisted on burning at the stake. So, on October 27th, 1553, Servetus was solemnly marched out to the pyre in a spirit of Catholic-Protestant cooperation that was exceedingly rare for the time. His last words were said to be, "Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have mercy on me," a final refusal to acknowledge the Trinity that had doomed him. Servetus's execution sent shockwaves through the reformist community and all of learned Europe. Some applauded Calvin for so vigorously expunging a dangerous heresy, while others were appalled by his complicity in what they saw as judicial murder. The affair arguably did more damage to Calvin's reputation as an enlightened reformer than to Servetus's posthumous one as a martyr for free thought. In later years, prominent thinkers like Voltaire would hold up Servetus as the epitome of a brilliant mind snuffed out by intolerant dogmatism. But while Calvin and the Inquisition represent some of the worst religious excesses of the medieval period, the influence of faith on the justice system wasn't always so bloody. In fact, one of the more peculiar medieval punishments was the trial by blessed sacrament, a kind of spiritual lie detector test. In this ordeal, a person accused of a crime would be brought before a priest and made to swallow a dry communion wafer. If they choked on the wafer, it was taken as a sign from God of their guilt, since divine forces were presumably preventing them from ingesting the sacred bread. The idea was that even if a suspect could fool an earthly court, they could never deceive the Almighty. Of course, from a modern perspective, it's laughably easy to see the flaws in such a system. An anxious, innocent person might easily choke on a mouthful of dry wafer under pressure, while a practiced liar could probably fake a swallow with no divine interference. But at the time, trials by blessed sacrament were accepted as a valid judicial tool, a way of outsourcing difficult decisions to a higher power. And in a way, that belief in divine judgment undergirded many medieval punishments, however brutal they might appear to modern eyes. The tortures, mutilations, and executions were not just meant to inflict pain or even deter crime, but to restore a kind of cosmic balance. They were brutal acts of atonement, necessary to cleanse both the criminal and the community of sin. There was also, undeniably, an element of raw spectacle to many medieval punishments. The elaborate public rituals of shaming, torture, and execution were a form of grisly entertainment in a world with little to pass the time. They allowed the masses to indulge their darkest, most vindictive impulses while still feeling morally justified. It's no coincidence that public punishments were often scheduled on market days or religious holidays, ensuring the maximum number of jeering spectators. But as easy as it is to look back and judge the medieval justice system as barbaric, it's important to remember that punishments are always a product of their time and culture. The Middle Ages were a period of immense upheaval, with wars, plagues, famines, and religious schisms constantly threatening the social order. In such an unstable world, horrific punishments must have felt like a necessary evil, a way to keep the chaos at bay through brutality and fear. Moreover, it's not as though human nature has changed that much since the days of dungeons and gallows. We may have largely done away with the creative physical cruelties of the past, but the impulse to punish and shame still burns bright in our supposedly civilized modern world. One need only look at the media circus surrounding a high-profile criminal trial or the clamour of social media for the guilty to be cancelled and exiled from polite company to see that appetite for retribution in action. In fact, some scholars have argued that the ritualized violence of medieval punishments actually served as a kind of release valve for the pent-up aggression and anxiety of the populace. By channeling those darker impulses into a controlled spectacle of official justice, the authorities could keep them from spilling out into open revolt or vigilante chaos. The public could vicariously satisfy their bloodlust without having to pick up a pitchfork themselves. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a defense of medieval brutality by any means. The punishments we've discussed were still undeniably cruel, disproportionate, and often gruesomely arbitrary. The condemned, whether guilty or innocent, suffered horribly in ways that are stomach-churning to contemplate. And the system was rife with abuses, as those in power exploited the violent machinery of punishment for their own gain. But I do think it's important, as we look back on the more shocking chapters of our history, to try to understand them in context. The medieval period was a time of profound instability, superstition, and religiosity, when life was often nasty, brutish, and short for even the most privileged. In such a world, it's perhaps not surprising that punishments took on a nasty, brutish cast as well. And yet, even in the face of all that brutality, there are still glimmers of humanity to be found in the historical record. Consider the case of Margaret Dixon, a Scottish woman condemned to hang in 1728 for the crime of infanticide. After her apparent death by hanging, Dixon's body was cut down and placed in a coffin for burial. But on the way to the graveyard, the pallbearers were startled by a knocking sound from inside the casket. Upon opening it, they found Dixon very. As the story of Margaret Dixon illustrates, even in the brutal world of medieval punishments, there were occasional glimmers of hope and humanity. Dixon's astonishing survival was seen by many as a sign of divine intervention, a message that perhaps her sentence had been unjust. In an age where the line between crime and sin was often blurred, such miracles carried great weight. Indeed, religious beliefs played a central role in shaping medieval approaches to justice and punishment. The notion that criminals were not just offenders against the law, but against God himself, added an extra layer of severity to many sentences. This was particularly evident in the case of heresy, which was seen as a direct affront to divine authority. Perhaps no institution embodied this religious zeal more than the Spanish Inquisition. Established in 1478 by King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I, the Inquisition was tasked with rooting out and punishing religious dissent in Spain and its territories. Central to this mission were the infamous auto de fe ceremonies, elaborate public spectacles where convicted heretics were paraded before crowds and burned at the stake. The auto da fe was equal parts religious ritual and gruesome entertainment. Condemned heretics, dressed in pointed caps and sanbenitos, yellow robes painted with hellish imagery, were led through the streets in a solemn procession, often accompanied by effigies of those who had died in prison before they could face the flames. After a lengthy public sermon, the sentences were read out, and the condemned were handed over to secular authorities for execution. One of the most famous victims of the Inquisition's fires was Michael Servetus, a brilliant Spanish theologian and physician. Servetus had provoked outrage with his unorthodox views on the Trinity and the nature of Christ, views which put him at odds with both the Catholic Church and the growing Protestant movement. In 1553, Servetus made the fateful decision to visit Geneva, the heart of the Protestant Reformation under the leadership of John Calvin. Despite travelling under an assumed name, Servetus was recognised and arrested. After a lengthy trial, he was convicted of heresy and sentenced to death. On October 27, 1553, Servetus was led to the stake on the outskirts of Geneva. His last request was for a more merciful death by the sword, but this was denied. As the flames consumed him, Servetus reportedly cried out, "O Jesus, Son of the eternal God, have pity on me." His ashes were scattered to the winds, a final erasure of a man deemed too dangerous to be remembered. Servetus's story is a chilling reminder of the deadly serious nature of religious disputes in the medieval world. In an age where the line between temporal and spiritual authority was often blurred, religious dissent could be seen as not just a challenge to the church, but to the very fabric of society itself. Of course, not all religious punishments were quite so severe. In some cases, the power of faith was invoked in a more symbolic way, as a means of divining guilt or innocence. One such method was the trial by Blessed Sacrament, a procedure that hinged on the belief in the miraculous power of the Eucharist. Under this ordeal, a suspect would be brought before a priest and made to swallow a dry communion wafer, usually accompanied by prayers and invocations. If the suspect choked on the wafer or struggled to swallow it, this was seen as a sign of guilt, a physical manifestation of their sin. If, on the other hand, they swallowed it easily, this was taken as proof of their innocence in the eyes of God. While the trial by Blessed Sacrament may seem less brutal than burning at the stake, it was no less a violation of the accused's basic humanity. The notion that choking on a dry wafer was a reliable indicator of guilt or innocence speaks to the magical thinking that often surrounded medieval justice. As we've seen throughout this journey through the strange world of medieval punishments, the line between justice and cruelty was often paper-thin. From the agonizing tortures of the rack and the brazen bull to the humiliating spectacle of the stocks and the deadly theatre of the auto-da-fe, these punishments were designed not just to condemn, but to break the spirit and obliterate the humanity of the condemned. And yet, for all their brutality, medieval punishments were also a product of their time, reflecting the religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and cultural anxieties of the age. In a world where life was often nasty, brutish, and short, the spectacle of public punishment served as a potent reminder of the consequences of transgression, a warning to the masses to stay in line. It's tempting to look back at these barbaric practices with a sense of smug superiority, to congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. And indeed, the worst excesses of medieval justice, the torture chambers and the burning stakes, have largely faded into history, at least in the Western world. But as any student of history knows, the march of progress is never a straight line. Even today, in an age of human rights and due process, the spectre of cruel and unusual punishment still looms. From the inhumane conditions of many modern prisons to the continued use of the death penalty in some parts of the world, the dark impulses that animated medieval justice have not been fully exorcised. Perhaps then the true value of studying these old atrocities lies not in condemning our ancestors, but in recognizing our own capacity for cruelty and injustice. By confronting the worst of our past, we can strive to build a future where punishment is tempered by mercy, where justice is not just a lofty ideal, but a living reality. As we close this journey through the darkest corners of medieval history, I invite you to ponder these questions in the quiet of the night. Let the strange and disturbing tales of medieval punishments be a reminder of both how far we've come and how far we still have to go. And if you found these grim yet fascinating stories a welcome companion in your quest for rest, I humbly ask that you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure that we can continue to explore the shadowy corners of history, one sleepy listener at a time. But for now, let us bid goodnight to the ghosts of the medieval past. May your dreams be untroubled by visions of racks and stakes, and may the coming day bring with it a renewed appreciation for the freedoms and mercies we too often take for granted. Until next time, this is your faithful chronicler of forgotten histories, wishing you a peaceful and nightmare-free slumber. Good night.